Before we begin today's episode, we want to acknowledge that today's conversation touches on cultural expectations, mental health, and the evolving role of men in modern society. These topics can be deeply personal and sometimes emotional, especially for people navigating questions about identity, family, and responsibility in a changing world. Our goal in this discussion isn't to criticize or dismiss anyone's experiences, but to explore the challenges many men and families are facing today, including mental health struggles, changing cultural narratives, and the pressures that come with redefining roles in society. As always, we encourage listeners to approach the conversation thoughtfully and with respect for different perspectives. Complex social issues rarely have simple answers, and today's discussion is about understanding the conversation, not ending it.
Over the past few years, a question has quietly started surfacing in conversations across the country, in barbershops, at family dinners, and podcasts, and increasingly across social media. What does it mean to be a man today? For generations, masculinity was defined by a handful of expectations that most people understood instinctively. Provide, protect, be strong, take responsibility. Those ideas weren't always easy to live up to, but they were clear. But somewhere along the way, that clarity started to blur. In modern culture, masculinity is often discussed in two very different ways. In some spaces, traditional male traits like strength, competitiveness, and assertiveness are still valued as essential parts of leadership and responsibility. In other spaces, those same traits are criticized as outdated, harmful, or what's often labeled toxic masculinity. And that tension has created a strange moment in society. On one hand, many men are being told they need to be more open, more emotionally expressive, and more collaborative. Things that can absolutely be healthy and necessary. But at the same time, many also feel like the traditional expectations placed on them haven't gone away. They're still expected to provide, still expected to protect, still expected to carry responsibility when things go wrong. So, the result for a lot of men is confusion, because the rules seem to be shifting while the responsibilities remain. And you can see that confusion showing up in real-world data. Men are falling behind in education at increasing rates. College enrollment among young men has dropped significantly compared to women. Mental health struggles and suicide rates remain higher among men than women. Many men report feeling disconnected, unsure where they fit in a culture that seems to be redefining their role. At the same time, society still depends heavily on men in ways we don't always talk about. In dangerous jobs, in military service, in infrastructure, in protecting families and communities. So tonight we're asking a serious question. Is masculinity under attack, or is it simply evolving? Are cultural expectations for men becoming healthier and more balanced, or are we creating a generation of young men who feel lost about what's expected of them? Because if we want healthy families, healthy communities, and a healthy society, the role of men, just like the role of women, matters. And that's the conversation tonight. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this conversation sits right at the intersection of culture, psychology, and societal change. And I expect we're going to get some very different perspectives. Brian's here, and I know he's going to argue that a lot of the confusion men feel today comes from cultural messaging that has spent years criticizing traditional masculinity instead of guiding it. For Brian, masculinity has always been tied to responsibility, providing for family, protecting those around you, and carrying your share of the load when things get hard. Rachel is here, and she'll bring the research and the psychological lens to the conversation. She's going to help separate perception from data, looking at trends in mental health, education gaps, and social expectations to understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. Daniel will likely zoom out and look at the broader societal shifts, how cultural narratives evolve, how institutions shape identity, and whether the challenges men are facing today are the result of long-term structural changes rather than a single cultural moment. And Skylar will probably push the argument that masculinity isn't being attacked so much as it's being redefined, that society is asking men to expand their emotional and social roles rather than abandon strength or responsibility. And me? I'm here asking the question that a lot of people seem hesitant to ask out loud. If men are struggling to understand their place in modern society, is that a problem we should take seriously, or just part of cultural evolution? Let's get into it. All right, before we jump into opinions, I want to frame this conversation carefully, because this topic is bigger than social media debates or culture war headlines. When people hear the phrase masculinity under attack, some immediately roll their eyes and think it's exaggerated rhetoric. Others hear it and say it describes something they've been feeling for years, that the role of men in society has become unclear, criticized, or even discouraged. But if we strip away the slogans and look at some real trends, there are some serious questions worth discussing. Men make up the overwhelming majority of workplace fatalities. Men account for significantly higher suicide rates. Young men are increasingly falling behind in education, with women now outnumbering men in college enrollment by a wide margin. Many teachers and psychologists are raising concerns about boys disengaging earlier in school and struggling to find a sense of direction. And at the same time, cultural conversations around masculinity have shifted dramatically. Terms like toxic masculinity entered mainstream discussion. Traditional male traits like competitiveness, toughness, or stoicism are sometimes criticized as unhealthy, while other voices argue those same traits, when balanced properly, are exactly what society needs. So what we're left with is a complicated moment. Responsibilities for men haven't really disappeared. Society still expects men to provide, to step up in crisis, to protect families and communities, to build infrastructure, to serve in dangerous professions. But the cultural messaging around what it means to be a man has become less clear. And when expectations change faster than guidance does, confusion follows. So the real question tonight isn't whether masculinity is good or bad. The real question is whether modern culture has created a disconnect between the responsibilities men still carry and the way masculinity is talked about. Rachel, let me start with you. When you look at the data, education gaps, mental health statistics, social engagement trends, are men actually facing a growing identity challenge in modern society, or is this more about perception than reality?
I think the most responsible place to start this conversation is with the data, because once we look at the numbers, it becomes clear that something meaningful is happening, but it's more complicated than the phrase under attack. When we look at education trends, boys are indeed falling behind in several areas. In many countries, including the United States, girls now outperform boys in reading proficiency and overall academic engagement, and women now make up the majority of college students. That doesn't mean boys are incapable. It means the systems and expectations that once supported male engagement in education may not be functioning the same way they did a generation ago. Mental health statistics also show a concerning pattern. Men are less likely to seek psychological help, less likely to talk about emotional struggles, and, unfortunately, have significantly higher suicide rates. That suggests there's a cultural barrier around vulnerability that still exists, even as society encourages more emotional openness. But I think the key point here is that masculinity itself isn't the problem. Healthy masculinity, responsibility, resilience, leadership, protection has always played an important role in families and communities. The challenge arises when cultural messaging becomes confusing. If boys grow up hearing that traditional masculine traits are inherently harmful, but still feel pressure to embody responsibility and strength, they may struggle to reconcile those messages. So I wouldn't frame the issue as masculinity being attacked. I would frame it as masculinity being debated and redefined at a time when many young men are already trying to find their place in a rapidly changing world. And when identity is unclear, guidance becomes incredibly important.
Rachel, that distinction is important because redefining something and destabilizing it are two very different things. And I think a lot of people listening right now probably recognize what you just described. They're not rejecting emotional growth or healthy change. They're reacting to the sense that the cultural conversation about men sometimes swings between two extremes. On one side, there's the idea that masculinity needs to evolve, to include emotional intelligence, empathy, partnership. On the other side, there's the concern that the traits historically associated with masculinity, strength, toughness, leadership, are being treated as problems instead of virtues. And when that pendulum swings too far in either direction, confusion sets in. Brian, let me bring you in here. From your perspective, is masculinity being redefined in a healthy way? Or do you think the cultural narrative has gone too far in criticizing the traditional role men have played in society?
Artie, I think Rachel made a really important point earlier. Masculinity itself isn't the problem, but I do think the cultural conversation around it has gone too far in one direction. And that's where the confusion comes from. For generations, masculinity was tied to responsibility. It wasn't just about toughness or bravado. It was about showing up when things got hard. It was about providing for your family, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, building things, fixing things, stepping into difficult roles that society depends on. That's the kind of masculinity that built communities, built infrastructure, and frankly still keeps the country running. But over the last decade or so, a lot of young men have grown up hearing that those same traits are suspicious or problematic. The term toxic masculinity gets used so broadly that sometimes it ends up painting masculinity itself as the issue instead of distinguishing between destructive behavior and healthy strength. And when you do that, you create a vacuum. Young men still feel the pull toward responsibility and leadership. That instinct doesn't just disappear, but they're not always given a clear model for how to channel it in a positive way. Instead of guidance, they often get criticism. I think that's why we're seeing so many young men drifting, not because they don't want responsibility, but because they're not sure how they're supposed to express it in a culture that sends mixed signals. And here's the thing, society still depends on masculine traits whether we acknowledge it or not. Firefighters, soldiers, construction workers, electricians, mechanics, these are jobs that require toughness, endurance, and a willingness to step into risk. Those qualities aren't toxic, they're necessary. So for me, the conversation shouldn't be about tearing masculinity down. It should be about guiding it, teaching boys how to channel strength into discipline, leadership, and responsibility. When masculinity is healthy, it's not dangerous, it's stabilizing. And I think that's what a lot of people feel is missing right now. Not masculinity, but mentorship.
Brian, the word you used there, mentorship, might be the hinge of this entire conversation. Because if masculinity is about responsibility, discipline, leadership, protection, those things aren't instincts that automatically develop in a vacuum. They're learned, they're modeled, they're passed down. And historically, that modeling happened in a lot of places: fathers, coaches, shop classes, military service, apprenticeship work, even community institutions like churches or civic organizations. Boys had environments where older men demonstrated what maturity looked like. But if you look at society today, many of those pathways have weakened or disappeared. Fatherlessness is higher. Hands-on trade mentorship is less common in schools. Many institutions that once provided male role models have shrunk or changed. So when people talk about an identity crisis among men, I sometimes wonder if what we're really looking at is a mentorship deficit. Because masculinity doesn't disappear. It just goes unguided. And when it goes unguided, it can drift into confusion, resentment, or disengagement. And that brings us to the bigger structural question. Daniel, I want to bring you in here. When you step back and look at society over the past few decades, cultural shifts, economic changes, educational changes, do you see what's happening with men as a cultural backlash or a deeper structural shift in how modern society is organized?
Artie, I think the most accurate way to understand what's happening is to look at how the structure of society has changed over the past 50 years. Masculinity didn't suddenly become controversial overnight. What changed were the economic and social systems that once gave men a very clear role. For most of the 20th century, a large portion of male identity was tied directly to economic contribution. Industrial jobs, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, these fields didn't just provide income, they provided purpose. A man could graduate high school, step into a trade or factory job, and immediately feel like he was contributing to a family and a community. But as economies shifted towards service and information industries, that pathway narrowed. Many of the jobs that historically absorbed large numbers of young men either disappeared, became automated, or required different skill sets and educational pathways. That created a transition period that society is still trying to navigate. At the same time, cultural expectations evolved. Women expanded their presence in higher education and the workforce, which is a major positive development. but it also changed the traditional framework where men defined themselves primarily as providers. When both roles shift simultaneously, identity has to be renegotiated, and renegotiation takes time. The difficulty comes when cultural narratives move faster than social structures. If society criticizes old models of masculinity but doesn't clearly articulate new ones, young men are left in a transitional space where expectations are unclear. So what we're seeing isn't necessarily masculinity being attacked, it's masculinity moving through a structural transition. Economic roles changed, family dynamics changed, cultural expectations changed. And the challenge for this generation is figuring out how to redefine masculine identity in a way that preserves responsibility and purpose while adapting to a different social landscape. Transitions like that are rarely smooth, and they often produce exactly what we're seeing now: uncertainty about where the next stable model will come from.
Daniel, what you just described really reframes the conversation. Because if masculinity is going through a structural transition rather than simply being criticized culturally, that changes how we think about the problem. It suggests that part of what men are feeling right now isn't just cultural pressure, it's displacement. When the traditional economic pathways that once gave men purpose begin to disappear or change, identity has to adapt, and adaptation is rarely comfortable. But here's where the conversation becomes complicated. Because while some people see this as a crisis for men, others see it as a necessary evolution, an opportunity to redefine masculinity in healthier ways that include emotional openness, partnership in families, and broader definitions of success. And that's where I want to bring Skylar in. Skylar, when people say men are struggling to understand their role in modern society, some view that as evidence something has gone wrong. Others argue it's simply a moment of adjustment while gender roles evolve. So, from your perspective, are we watching a cultural backlash against changing expectations, or are we seeing the growing pains of a healthier definition of masculinity emerging?
I think Daniel's point about structural transition is really important because it moves the conversation away from blame and toward understanding how society changes over time. Roles that once seemed permanent often evolve as economies, education systems, and family dynamics shift. And in many ways, masculinity today is going through that kind of evolution. For a long time, men were socialized primarily around strength, provision, and emotional restraint. Those traits helped men survive in physically demanding environments and hierarchical work structures. But as society changes, the skills needed for healthy relationships, workplaces, and communities expand as well. That doesn't mean strength, responsibility, or leadership are obsolete. It means the definition of those qualities may be broadening. Emotional intelligence, cooperation, and communication are becoming just as important as physical toughness or stoicism. And for some men, that shift can feel disorienting because it asks them to balance traits that historically weren't emphasized together. I also think it's important to recognize that many men are already adapting in positive ways. Younger generations of fathers, for example, are often more involved in parenting than previous generations. Men are more open to discussing mental health than they once were. Those changes can strengthen families and communities. But transitions take time, and they're rarely comfortable. When expectations evolve faster than social guidance, confusion is natural. The goal shouldn't be to reject masculinity or defend it blindly. It should be to define what healthy masculinity looks like in a society that values both strength and empathy. And that conversation is still unfolding.
You know, listening to this conversation, I think one thing becomes really clear. This topic isn't nearly as simple as the slogans people throw around online. Because when people hear a phrase like masculinity under attack, they often imagine a political argument. But what we're actually talking about tonight is something much deeper: identity, responsibility, and purpose in a society that's changing quickly. Rachel pointed out that the data shows some real challenges for young men right now, education gaps, mental health struggles, disengagement in certain areas of society. Brian raised the concern that when cultural conversations criticize masculinity too broadly, young men can feel like the traits they naturally gravitate toward are problems rather than strengths. Daniel reminded us that much of this may be tied to structural changes in the economy and social institutions, and Schuyler highlighted that masculinity itself may not be disappearing at all. It may simply be evolving into something broader. And maybe the real answer sits somewhere in the middle of all those perspectives. Because societies do change, roles evolve, expectations shift, but human needs don't change as quickly as cultural narratives do. Young men still need purpose. They still need guidance. They still need models of what responsible adulthood looks like. And when those models disappear or become unclear, confusion fills the gap. That's why conversations like this matter, not to argue about whether masculinity is good or bad, but to ask what healthy masculinity actually looks like in the world we're living in today. Because strong communities need strong men, not angry men, not absent men, responsible men. Men who can lead families, support partners, mentor younger generations, build things, protect what matters, and still have the emotional awareness to grow and adapt when the world around them changes. That balance has never been easy to define, but it's one of the most important conversations a society can have. And that's the conversation tonight.
All right, before we move into final thoughts, let's take a quick moment to thank the community that keeps Data and Dissonance going. If you enjoy the conversations we're having here, thoughtful discussions about culture, society, politics, and the issues shaping everyday life, one of the best ways to support the show is through the Data and Dissonance merch store. We've got a full lineup of gear designed for independent thinkers. That includes our patriotic apparel, Gen X designs, and some of our most popular bumper stickers like Make Orwell Fiction Again, Keep Your Feelings Off My Freedoms, and Triggered, Good. It's merch that represents the spirit of the show. Asking questions, thinking independently, and not being afraid to challenge the narrative. And of course, a lot of listeners are big fans of the Data and Dissonance coffee line. Whether you like a lighter roast to start your morning, or something bold enough to get you through late-night research and podcast listening, we've got 3 blends available: High Lakes Light Roast, Rock Creek Medium Roast, and Bitter Root Dark French Roast. You can check out all the merch, coffee, and new designs at the store link and on the website. Every purchase helps support the show and keeps these conversations independent. And we truly appreciate every one of you who listens, shares the episodes, and supports the community.
You know, if there's one thing tonight's conversation highlights, it's that the question of masculinity isn't really about winning an argument. It's about understanding a transition. Every generation inherits a slightly different version of the world than the one their parents lived in. Economic systems change, cultural expectations evolve, technology reshapes how people work, communicate, and build relationships. And as those things shift, identities naturally shift with them. But transitions can be messy. When old models fade before new ones are clearly defined, people feel it. And I think that's part of what many men are experiencing right now. Not necessarily an attack, but a moment where the expectations surrounding masculinity are less clearly defined than they once were. And clarity matters. Young men need examples of responsibility. They need mentors who demonstrate discipline, leadership, and character. They need to see what healthy masculinity actually looks like, not in theory, but in practice. That kind of guidance has always been important. But in a world where cultural messages are coming from every direction, social media, entertainment, politics, education, it becomes even more important to talk about these questions openly. Because the goal isn't to rewind society or freeze it in the past. The goal is to make sure that as culture evolves, we don't lose the values that build strong families and strong communities. Strength, responsibility, integrity, mentorship. Those things have never been outdated. They're foundations. And if we want the next generation to grow into capable men who contribute to society, lead their families, and support their communities, then those foundations still matter. So maybe the real question isn't whether masculinity is under attack. Maybe the real question is how we define healthy masculinity for the future. And that's a conversation worth continuing. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, where global politics, intelligence operations, and high-stakes decisions collide. If you enjoy the conversations we have here on the show about leadership, responsibility, and the forces shaping the world around us, then you'll want to check out the books that helped inspire many of these discussions. The Covenant Protocol launches the Caleb Rourke story, pulling readers into a world of covert operations, geopolitical tension, and the dangerous decisions that shape global events. The story continues in The Prophet Directive, where the stakes grow even higher and the line between national security and global chaos becomes razor thin. And the series continues with Book 3, Black Echo Rising, expanding the world even further. But the creative universe behind Data and Dissonance doesn't stop with books. The show is also supported by the music coming out of the same creative space. If you enjoy country storytelling and American roots music, you can check out the albums Uncaged and Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, both available on Spotify and major streaming platforms. These albums blend country influences, grunge-inspired storytelling, and songs about faith, family, freedom, and the struggles that shape who we become. Tracks like Stand Tall Charlie capture that spirit of resilience and strength, the same themes we talk about here on the show. You can find the books on Amazon, the music on Spotify and streaming platforms, and everything connected to the show, merch, coffee, and more through the website. Independent stories, independent music, independent thought. And that's what Data and Dissonance is all about.